Well, my name is Preston Dennett. Grew up mostly in California, very skeptical of UFOs until I was 21 years old. That's 1986. And I heard about a sighting over Alaska on the news. It really shocked me because this subject was rarely covered on the news. And when it was kind of in a joking way, which was true in this case, but they showed this picture of this pilot, Captain Kenju Torochi. I'll never forget it. Describing this amazing UFO encounter he and his crew had over Alaska. And that's when I remembered that my older brother Mark had said he'd seen a UFO some years earlier. So for some reason that broke through my skepticism and I asked him about it. He described this amazing sighting. His two friends were with him. They saw this classic flying saucer with little lights on it. It was very low, totally quiet. They actually chased it in their car down Reseda Boulevard. This is in Southern California where we lived. And that's kind of what started the ball rolling for me. Turned out I knew a number of people who had had encounters but hadn't told me because I was so skeptical. But yeah, friends, family, coworkers, a bunch of people started sharing their encounters with me. I found out about MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and joined them. This is a UFO study group. I became a field investigator for them, started investigating cases myself, started buying every book I could find on this subject. I mean, I dove deep into it. It took about a year for me to really come to grips with the fact that UFOs are real. It was a big adjustment, but super interesting. I started writing articles, did research for about 10 years, really, writing articles and going to conventions and sometimes speaking there or on the radio, and even on television a few times. After about 30 articles and 10 years of research, I put out my first book. This was called UFO Healings. It covered cases of people who've been healed as a result of a UFO encounter, and started putting out books pretty much once a year on the average after that. And now, some 35, almost 40 years later, I've written 32 books, more than 100 articles, interviewed hundreds of people, and investigated not only UFOs, but a wide variety of the paranormal, because as I'm sure you might suspect, it's all connected. I kept hearing reports of, paranormal events, everything from hauntings to Bigfoot to out-of-body experiences, precognition, all of it kind of coming at once for some witnesses. I mean, I think that we're dealing with separate phenomenon here. I don't think that this is all one thing. I know there are some researchers who kind of conflate all these things together and say it's a phenomenon that wears different masks and is just manifesting in different ways. I don't really prescribe to that theory. I think when someone's seeing a ghost or a Bigfoot or having an out-of-body experience or what have you, they are sensing things correctly. And I take these events sort of at face value, I guess, is a way of describing what I'm saying here. But I mean, hauntings can occur in a variety of ways. Sometimes people just move into a haunted house, or perhaps they use a Ouija board and that starts a haunting into taking place. Some people have an outbreak of poltergeist activity, which can, in fact, be them who are doing it. But there are weird similarities. I mean, a UFO encounter can happen very much spontaneously. And I think that there is a random aspect to it. But on the other hand, the deeper you look into it, I think there are ways to sort of understand why these events are occurring. With UFOs, particularly when people are taken on board or have direct contact, this is something that I think is intentional on the part of the ETs. They track certain families. They're very interested, I think, in people who have strong psychic abilities, and certainly do ignite that in a person. So a person might have an encounter and then suddenly they come back from this encounter and they start experiencing a wide variety of paranormal events. So there's a lot going on here and a lot to unpack with some really amazing, weird connections. For example, there was two ladies I interviewed who moved into a haunted apartment. They had a horrible time with this poltergeist-like activity. I really honestly think it was a demonic spirit, but they ended up moving out after just having this horrific haunting that went on for 3 or 4 months, involving everything from footsteps and doors opening and closing to cold spots, bad odors, a dark apparition that actually attacked one of the witnesses and tried to almost possess her. It's a very extensive case. But they moved out of that apartment and the haunting stopped. But it was about a week later that a very close-up UFO sighting, and they felt in some way that this was connected. And I have to agree because I hear this a lot. Like one lady I interviewed, she was taken on board, had a major encounter, came back the next day, had all kinds of poltergeist-like activity going on. So there are weird connections here that I'm not fully sure how they come together, but I'm starting to get a clue because there was one lady I interviewed. She had a very close encounter, came back and went to work, and she blew out her computer. And she went to the copier and blew that one out, and then the fax machine. I've talked to a number of people who've had this problem. One gentleman, he worked at a car welding factory. He kept blowing out the welding machine, which was very expensive. So I think people's bioelectric field is somehow being strengthened or increased as a result of their encounter. So yeah, an encounter can cause a person to suddenly become aware of ghosts that have probably already been around them the whole time. Suddenly they have mediumship abilities and might start attracting these things as well. So yeah, it's complicated. I think when there's many cases of people who have a near-death experience and they come back and they're having all kinds of paranormal experiences, astral projection, seeing ghosts, and might suddenly see a UFO. There's something going on here. So I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that ETs are aware of people who have strong psychic abilities. And I think are attracted to that to an extent. I think more often it works the other way. Someone will have a UFO encounter, and that will trigger a wide variety of paranormal events. So someone might come back from the encounter and have healing abilities, or start having mediumship abilities, or out-of-body experiences, or dreams that come true, precognition. So I think that happens more often than, say, someone having psychic experiences and then having a UFO encounter. But yeah, it's a two-way street for sure. It's a rare person who has had repeated UFO encounters that doesn't have all these experiences going on. Then again, there are a lot of people who are psychic and having all kinds of paranormal experiences who have not seen UFOs. So I tend to think it's more towards, the second, being that a UFO encounter will trigger psychic experiences rather than, having psychic experiences attracting extraterrestrial encounters or the attention of the ETs. ETs, almost as a rule, communicate telepathically, and just that simple activity, I think, really starts to get a person's psychic centers moving. And but even a simple sighting can sort of open a doorway for people, or a haunting gets them thinking of other, things that they considered unexplained, or it might kind of gives them a little bit of a psychic awakening or a spiritual enlightenment, which can send them on a pathway of seeking. So yeah, certainly just having a psychic experience can lead to you exploring all these different avenues of paranormal and UFO activity. Again, these are two separate things, and generally, they follow a fairly set pattern. A haunting usually involves doors opening and closing, lights going on and off, ghostly footsteps, objects disappearing and reappearing, apparitions, a whole wide variety of sort of poltergeist-like activity. Whereas a UFO encounter is, particularly an onboard encounter, does follow a fairly set sequence of events that are pretty much different. I will say I've interviewed a few people. One couple called me from Illinois once, and we're describing what sounded to me like a fairly typical haunting. And they said, well, we're also seeing this craft floating over our house at night. So sometimes I think ETs will come to a person's house and not necessarily be visible. So people will hear them moving around at night, or perhaps see something moving out of the corner of their eye, or have little balls of light. So there is a little bit of a bleed through here. Yeah, a haunting follows a very regular series of events that's quite different from a UFO. or ET encounter. So I think they're pretty easy to tell apart once you dive deep into what people are actually experiencing. I would say probably there's a lot more people experiencing ghosts who don't experience UFOs, as opposed to people who are experiencing UFOs and entities almost always will have ghostly activity. In a sense, yeah, I think that when people are having, particularly people who are having very extensive encounters with ETs, it's pretty rare that they don't experience ghosts as well. Vice versa, no, for whatever reason. Ghosts, I think, are quite a bit more common, or certainly more acceptable socially, so people perhaps talk about them more. Coming to realize that UFO encounters are not nearly as rare as I thought them to be. I think there was a quote by J. Allen Hynek that 1 in 40 people have been on board a craft. I heard that early on in my research, and I thought, gosh, that's a lot. I should know somebody who's been on board, and of course I did. So I do think UFO encounters are quite a bit more common than even people within the UFO community recognize. Ghosts have been around for so long and been recognized for thousands of years, where the UFO phenomena, true, we can track it back all the way to ancient times, prehistory, really, but really only became recognized since the modern age of UFOs, 1947 onward. I'm not sure that that exactly answers the question, but a lot of fuzzy research going on and a lot of speculation and frankly disinformation and outright lies. And I think a lot of people have a tendency to view things through the lens of their own belief system. There's a lot of fear and confusion surrounding this subject. So I've tried really hard to be very objective, not impose my own beliefs on what's going on, allow the witnesses to speak for themselves, because even they have problems with fear, which distorts your perception. It's my assessment that these are different things. I think ETs are people, very much like us, more like us than different. By all indications, they're biological beings who, like us, do have interdimensional aspects. I mean, we have a soul. We do have life after death. There's definitely interdimensional aspects to all entities, I think. But as near as I can tell, shadow people are something completely different. I have talked to a lot of contactees who've described seeing shadow people, which are generally described without a whole lot of, facial detail, certainly not wearing jumpsuits like we often hear ETs or cloaks or anything like this. They're more apparitions and probably a lower dimensional entity of some kind. This is certainly what some contactees have told me. I mean, there's one guy in England who was having all kinds of encounters with grays. He didn't particularly like it, but following his encounters, he started seeing shadow people. And there's another contactee who I love. She's amazing. Her name is Dolly Saffron. I wrote a whole book about her case called Symmetry. And she's seen shadow people. And I asked her about it, and she's like, I think they're probably lower two-dimensional entities, but do have an awareness and can interact with us to a certain extent. But yeah, it's my assessment that shadow people are a sort of a dimensional entity, whereas ETs are physical like us, but certainly have an understanding of dimensions, but travel in craft and come from other planets, live on planets like we do. Whereas these shadow people are more of what we would consider to be like a ghost, without form. They're a mystery. I think we know a lot more about ETs than we do about so-called shadow people. I think that ETs have a way of traveling interdimensionally. In fact, the more I do the research, it's clear that they're not traveling from interstellar distances, as we would, or as we travel here using propellants and moving along from one line to another. They are able to produce huge amounts of electricity to basically open a dimensional doorway and pop from one location to another, not through a wormhole or anything, but actually moving out of this dimension and coming back into it at the desired location. So I wouldn't say that they use black holes or portals or anything like that, but they are able to open up sort of a doorway from one location and get to another. Whereas spirits are able to they're traveling in another dimension. So time and space is sort of irrelevant to them. And they can do, I mean, to us, would probably best find is almost teleporting in a way. But certainly they're walking through walls and appearing and disappearing and are able to sort of, on the other side, people can fly around, they're floating around and they're not confined to the laws that really govern the third dimension. So no, I don't think they're coming through portals. Certainly there's certain areas that are known to be haunted. And they seem to be sort of, to some extent, confined to these areas, earthbound, you might be a way of putting it. But spirits can come and go as they please from higher dimensions, come down and visit us. Like our deceased loved ones can come down very easily, and then off they go. They can see us, and a lot of us. We cannot see them as easily, apparently, because our psychic abilities aren't as developed. Whereas on the other side, that's a natural state of affairs. I think it's more us doing it because when someone has an encounter that's completely out of your worldview, it can be very hard to process. And so they might see an ET and come away from it with what we call a screen memory. So they'll recall maybe seeing an owl or a deer or I mean, I've heard a whole variety of, sort of memories that mask what's really going on here. And sometimes people have a real, there's amnesia or memory problems associated with some very close encounters. And what's apparently going on here is that people are forgetting it much in the manner of a dream, or because they're in such a state of panic, they don't want to remember. We know the human mind, when traumatized, can very easily compartmentalize memories. We see this with victims of child abuse or assault or car accidents or people in war times. They will have amnesia of the event, and it's their own mind protecting them. When someone's taken on board a craft and they're having a complete panic reaction, the ETs, that's the last thing they are wanting to do is scare a person. In fact, that's the first thing they'll say is, don't be afraid. Have no fear. We're not here to hurt you. But if a person is so panicking, well, they'll facilitate your own ability to sort of compartmentalize and suppress the memory until you're emotionally able to handle it. So yeah, to some extent, they're able to do that, but it's really us doing it. Now, it can be a little tricky because someone might have an encounter, say, an ET comes into the bedroom and they're pulled up into a craft and come back and wake up in bed and they might remember it as a dream when in fact it was a completely physical encounter. Or it can be days later, they completely suppressed it and then they start dreaming about it. So they're, actually remembering a physical encounter, but it is a dream. It's just that the memory is coming back through the dream state. But there are, cases of people say telepathically in contact with ETs, speaking to them in sort of a dreamlike way, astrally, you might put it. I would say that's more the exception than the rule. It's pretty clear to me that these encounters are physical. They're not dreams. They cannot be explained away as so-called sleep paralysis. And we know people are having these encounters physically because often they're missing from their bedrooms, or they come back and they have an implant, or they're healed, or people in the neighborhood are seeing UFOs hovering over their house, or there's, landing traces in their backyard, or two people in a house are taken on board together, or both will see the ETs, the husband and wife, or brother and sister, or what have you. So yeah, it's absolutely a physical experience, but certainly people sometimes remember it as a dream or will remember it through a dream. When someone has an ET encounter, it's rarely a one-off, particularly if they're seeing ETs face to face or definitely being taken on board. Yeah, they are of interest to the ETs. ETs do seem to follow certain family lines. This is very well established. So if you're seeing ETs face to face or you've been taken on board, I would ask your parents, your aunts, your uncles, your children, because as a general rule, this does follow family lines. It's not always the case. There are some people who've had a singular experience and it never happens again. But in most cases, no, it's something that starts very early in childhood and continues on through adult life. It might be only a few experiences. It might be very much regular. I think it all depends on the person, the ETs and that person's awareness and their willingness to work with the ETs. Someone who is like not having a good time with it and just doesn't like it will probably have less experiences. You know, ETs will respect that they're, again, not wanting to scare people. But it's true with, paranormal activity as well. People who are just psychic by nature almost always have paranormal experiences throughout their life. Some people have mediumistic abilities, and they're going to regularly see ghosts. And again, an encounter can spark these abilities in a person. So you can, probably not have a whole lot of psychic events. And then you're pulled on board, and suddenly you're experiencing telepathy with the ETs and levitation and all this stuff. And you come back, and it opens up your psychic abilities to a degree that it becomes a regular thing for you. So yeah, uh, it can, one experience or the other trigger a whole bunch of events to occur following an experience. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things that happen to a person when they have an encounter. I've got a list of like 20 different things, and it can be very difficult for people to process, particularly in the beginning. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who have developed a fear of clowns following an encounter as young children, or a fear of closets. Fear of intruders is another thing. Many describe a feeling of being watched, like something is looking over them in some way. There's all these different sort of little signs and clues that happen to a person, which might point towards contact that they're not even perhaps aware of. So, yeah, I hear these sort of things all the time. Yeah, it's hard for me to speak about MIBs because I've certainly read about them, but I haven't personally gotten any real good cases of this. So I wonder about it. John Keel, he's the author who really sort of popularized that. And people conflate him with government agents, which, obviously do exist. And there's quite a few, so-called men in black government agents who try to cover up evidence and will threaten people. But there are reports of these MIBs too, which, I just don't get a whole lot of cases of them. So I really don't know if they're ET or not, or if people are, having a screen memory of some kind, or are these human-looking ETs? Because ETs do come in many different forms. Yeah, I'm really not sure what to think of them. There's a few, gosh, there's a very large freshwater lake. I forget the name of it, but it's a very popular tourist destination. Yeah, I can't remember it, but anyway, I believe it's in the Ontario area. I interviewed a gentleman who got really interested in CE5 work, really wanted to see a UFO, and did a lot of meditating and started seeing UFOs. And then one day he went and rented a cabin with his friends along this very large freshwater lake. Gosh, I just can't quite remember the name of it. At any rate, he decided, like, let's take a walk along the beach. It's a very popular tourist spot. And his friend's like, no, no, I don't want to do that. It's late. Doesn't know why he insisted, but he did. And so it's a group of 5 friends or so, and they're walking along the beach when suddenly he noticed that all his friends had become frozen, stopped in place. And in fact, everything seemed frozen. The leaves on the trees, the wind, the waves, all of it. He's freaking out because this is not normal. And this is when he sees these very tall figures standing by the beach of this lake. And they don't look normal either because they're dressed in sort of black jumpsuits and they look like they're really tall. Next thing he knows, he's in front of them. So there was a sort of a skip in time and he's right there next to them. And he says they were 9 feet, if not 10 feet tall. I'm like, listen, that's pretty tall. Are you sure? He's like, well, listen, I'm 6'3", and I was looking up at them like that. So they had very dark or thick skin that was very wrinkled, not human because their faces were far too broad, huge chins. Scared the daylights out of him because he's like, you can't be here. What are you doing? And they basically said, well, we can come and go as we please. No, nobody can stop us. That's all he really remembers, except some memory of walking home and waking up the next morning and not remembering it really at all until suddenly he did. It just came back into his mind and because they went back there again. And he asked his friends, hey, do you guys remember taking a walk along the beach last time? And they're like, oh, yeah, I do remember that. You went running off towards those guys, those weird looking guys standing at the shoreline. And he's like, oh, you do remember. That's all they remembered. they didn't remember them looking that strange or, being frozen or anything like that. I don't know. It's a weird event. I did talk to another guy, had a cabin, his parents did up in, it was somewhere in Ontario, Toronto area, a friend, and the two of them became very interested in out of body experiences and were studying them when suddenly they met this guy who was quite strange. He said his name was Peter, and he started introducing them to all these psychic abilities and basically hinted that he was in contact with UFOs and ETs. He's an adult, right? And they're teenagers, but he would meet with them regularly to sort of develop their psychic abilities. One day they're driving along in the car. He's like, "Would you like to see a UFO? Would you like to go on board?" They became frightened. Like, no, they realized like this is a little bit too much. But it was shortly after that they were in their cabin, or there's three of these guys, and two of them came running in like, "We just saw a Martian." He's like, "What are you talking about?" And described a typical gray. So the guy I talked to was pretty disappointed. He wanted to see it, and it was a short time later. He's walking over the same bridge where the other two had seen it, and they were behind him about 100 yards. And he sees this tiny little figure standing in the parking lot looking at him. And he looks over the bridge, and it's a gray. And so it really startled him, and he sort of looked forward and opened his eyes. He says the gray, in a sort of little playful, cute way, did the same thing, acted pretend startled, sort of mocking him. So that even made him shake his head more. And the gray did the same thing. So he said it was almost this playful elf-like quality to this little gray. It's a really cool story. Ended up having another real close-up encounter. Sorry, I can't remember the name of that location either, but it was right north of Toronto. Yeah, I've gotten a few Canadian encounters. There was one guy I interviewed, James Santiago, who had this amazing encounter driving through the Canadian Rockies. This is not in Ontario, obviously, but he was driving with this lady who had convinced him to take a road trip. He didn't really like road trips, but they were both traveling to Vancouver. So he agreed to go, and she, partway through the trip announced, just so I'm being followed by UFOs, so we'll probably see one. He's like, oh, great. Who's this crazy lady? Turns out she's a pretty famous artist, really well known. So they're driving along, and she turns to him and says, "Do you feel that pressure?" And he's like, "No, what are you talking about?" She's like, "We're about to see a UFO. You'll feel it in just a few moments." And he did. He said it was this weird sort of oppressive atmosphere change, almost as if he was being pressed down to a seat, and everything became really quiet. And this is called the Oz effect by researchers. And he started to feel it really strongly. And she's kind of panicking and pressing down the accelerator. And this is the Rocky Mountains, and there's cliffs on one side of the road. So he's freaking out because she's speeding up the car. And suddenly there it was, this beautiful, he said it was emerald blue craft comes right over the car and shining down this light. And she's trying to outrun it, which of course you can't outrun a UFO. And it stayed with them for a good 5 or 10 minutes. And he said it was the strangest thing because while this craft was over him, he says he felt almost as if his awareness completely opened up. And he became more clear thinking, more intelligent, more aware than he's ever been in his entire life. It was really interesting to hear him describe this because I've heard other people say the same thing. But this craft followed them for a good, few miles there and then darted off. And they saw it a few more times on the way to Vancouver. Yeah, this lady was really amazing. She was psychic, she was a healer, she's a very famous artist, had had a lot of UFO experiences. Yeah, I think we've made some real recent strides towards, quote, disclosure. This subject is going mainstream. It's really encouraging to see. And it's amazing to see members of Congress and people, really governments all over the world, coming forward and talking about this seriously. Like Paul Hellyer, the former Defense Minister of Canada, making really definitive statements about the extraterrestrial presence. I got to meet him, by the way, a really nice gentleman. I got his books. They're very important, I think. And yeah, it's amazing to see people who are, in Congress, representatives and senators and people at very high levels of government making very positive statements. So I'm happy about that. I think honestly the best effect of all that is it is bringing more people into this field, making a lot of people take this subject more seriously. But I don't think it's disclosure by any means. I feel like this cover up is still very firmly in place. Our governments are not telling the truth. We have yet to have a sitting head of state say definitively UFOs are real and ETs have visited us. They're not admitting to the truth of so many major UFO events, like the UFO crash at Roswell in 1947, or the Malmstrom Air Force Base visitation where UFOs came and shut down our missiles in 1967, or the flyover of the Capitol in 1952, or so many others. And until they admit to, the truth of those events, I don't see any reason to believe anything they have to say about the subject. Show us the craft, show us the bodies. We know you have them. And they're not doing that. So I honestly don't trust them, and I don't think they will ever willingly be fully truthful and transparent and disclose everything they know. I'm a little bit jaded having been in this field for so long and just waiting for, disclosure to happen. I don't think it ever will, not in the way we would like it to. But on the other hand, since the subject is real, UFOs are real, there's no way you can hide the truth forever. Truth has a way of coming out, and that's exactly what we're seeing. I think this is why we have steps towards disclosure, because if our governments don't do this, they're going to become irrelevant. We will no longer look to them for answers. They will no longer be considered trustworthy. And they're at that point, actually. We don't trust them. Most people believe that the government does lie about this subject. And that's their own darn fault. They made their bed. If they had been truthful from the beginning, we'd be, I think, more likely to trust them on the subject. But they haven't. So that's their own fault. It's very tightly controlled, and it's a way of just sort of making sure that disclosure doesn't just come tumbling out. Because it's very interesting to me. They will talk about sightings, and they're even talking about, recovering of craft and bodies. They're not using those terms. They always like call them UAPs or NHI, non-human intelligence. And they're not talking about the fact that these craft have been landing and leaving traces, or all the radar cases, or all the really good evidence cases. And they're certainly not talking about the, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who've reported direct contact or been taken on board, like Travis Walton and Whitley Strieber and Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker and Betty Andreasen and Sergeant Moody and all these people, Herbert Shermer, who have had direct contact with ETs. They're not bringing a single contactee up to speak before Congress, which I think says volumes about, their true agenda here. I'd like to say it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but it's more like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, and 1 step sideways. Uh, because, there was a recent hearing, one of the more recent ones, with Lou Elizondo and Admiral Gallaudet and uh, Dr. Rich, I think was his name, and all these guys. And they were asked flat out, what do you think UFOs are? And they all kind of played dumb and acted like 5-year-old kids and said, I don't know. When I think they do know. I think our government has absolute knowledge that this is extraterrestrial. And they're not saying that. So yeah, I feel like ultimately the focus, the purpose behind these disclosures is to just sort of slow down the progress and make sure that the general public remains in the dark about what's really going on here. I mean, eventually it's got to, because the cat's out of the bag. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. The truth is spilling out. I feel like there's so much information, so many contactees, a huge army of researchers, so much interest in this subject that the cover up is leaking like a sieve. It's been a disastrous failure on all sides. The truth is coming out. But for me, full disclosure is not a head of state admitting to the truth of UFOs. It's not, the intelligence agencies showing a film of a blurry dot in the sky or showing us a piece of metal, which I think is what we're probably going to be seeing shortly this year. To me, the end game is seeing the craft, seeing the bodies, having public access to it, an absolute admission that we've been visited for a very long time, that they have all these craft and bodies. And I don't know that we're going to get that. I don't think the US is going to do it. I think it's much more likely that Brazil or Mexico or Chile or maybe Canada, France, I don't know. I doubt it's going to be one of the superpowers, so-called superpowers. But it should be really interesting to see how this all rolls out, because I think to some extent it's inevitable. But do I think we'll ever get full truth and transparency with the subject? I really don't. Our governments have lied about every subject, not just UFOs. And they've shown themselves to be, not trustworthy in so many areas, but particularly the UFO subject, that I just don't, unless it's to their advantage, I don't think that they're going to tell the truth. I think it's much more likely that the ETs will. And here's how I look at it, because people always say, well, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Just announce. To an extent, they already have. I mean, the Capitol flyovers were undeniable. And if we hadn't, sent military jets to intercept them and shoot them down, or try, because I don't think we can, we might have had, a completely different reception. We've been quite hostile towards them, or our governments, I should say, have. But here's how I look at it. In effect, disclosure on the part of the ETs has already happened. Because if you look at the worldwide massive database of UFO encounters, it numbers in the millions of documented cases. How many times do they need to show themselves to people? There has been massive waves over every single country on this planet, pretty much. In France in 1954, there was a wave of sightings and landings that was so intense it left no doubt in anyone living there at that time that there was something going on. Here in the United States, we've had waves over, pretty much every state has experienced a wave of some kind. In Wytheville, Virginia, there was a massive wave. Fife, Alabama, Texas had a wave over Stevensville. Gulf Breeze, Florida, New York State had a huge wave in the 1990s. And if you go through the literature on the subject, you'll see that this is pretty common, that every few years there's a wave of sightings over some place on this planet. And UFOs are showing themselves perhaps individually to small groups or sometimes to larger groups. I wrote a whole book about schoolyard cases, over 100 cases of this all over the world. Canada, US, England, Russia are leading, but pretty much every Africa, Australia, you name it, South America, these ETs have shown themselves publicly over schoolyards, showing themselves to large groups of people. It's a very effective method of announcing their presence, as well as over drive-in movie theaters all across the United. There's a case in Prince Edward Island in Canada where UFOs kept showing up over this one drive-in theater so many times that they actually put it on their marquee. If you want to see a UFO, come to our theater, because they kept showing up over the theater. So this is what I mean. They have disclosed the ETs, but in a way that's not going to cause complete collapse or panic in our society and disrupt all our institutions, because it's going to have a huge effect on religion and business and politics and science, certainly. And I think they're doing it in a way that slips into our society in a very pervasive and ubiquitous way, but without causing a complete disruption. On the other hand, and many contactees have gotten this message, if there should come an existential crisis, and I don't think that that's as unlikely as you might think if you look into the science of coronal mass ejections and climate change and the poles tipping and the fact that we are on a pathway towards self-destruction, be it through nuclear annihilation or destruction of the environment. ETs have told people that there could come a time when there is a mass extinction event and they will come down and scoop people up. That would certainly be showing themselves to all humanity. So I think that might be the method in which that occurs. We're in rough times up ahead by all accounts, whether you look to mainstream science or the near-death experiencers talk about this, Native American elders, wherever you look to for knowledge. We're in a rough time up ahead. Channelers talk about this, astral travelers, and certainly the ETs have been warning about nuclear proliferation and greed and corruption and war and aggression and destruction of the environment from the time they started pulling people on board. So yeah, I think in one way of looking at disclosure has already happened, but sooner or later, yeah. Or I mean, ETs announcing themselves. But sooner or later, yeah, I think it's inevitable that we will have not only disclosure, but open official contact.